So, Tribe, welcome back. Today we are here with HEMA, Western martial arts expert Mike Cartier, and he is coming to us from the Meyer Guild. We're going to go ahead and delve into some questions about Western martial arts, specifically the work of Meyer, and looking at the Guild and bringing this art back to the masses now in our present day. Mike, how are you?
Hi, Francis. How's it going, man? Thanks for having me.
Oh, no, great to have you on. We're looking forward to picking your brain. So, Mike, let's start off with just a brief introduction. Tell us a little bit about your martial arts background and about what you're focusing on right now as far as your studies.
Well, I've come through the usual route of martial arts, karate and stuff in my youth, and I went into Wing Chun, Kung Fu for a long time, and then there was a natural progression into the Jeet Kune Do of Bruce Lee's vision of martial arts, which was wonderful. That's where I got exposed to the eclectic concepts, how to, make your own art out of other arts that you learn. And through that wonderful experience, I got to run into Muay Thai, Jiu-Jitsu, Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, Kali Eskrima, or Savat, all those arts that were very formative in my martial art, history.
Now, the work of Meyer is a big leap from the Kali and the Jeet Kune Do circles. Tell us a little bit about who Meyer is and how you discovered Meyer.
Yeah, well, I ran into Meyer back about 15 years ago or so, maybe 14, when I was looking on the internet. Actually, it was more like 16, I think, now that I think about it. I'm looking on the internet, and I found John Clements doing kind of a flourish with a side sword. And it was very dynamic, extremely martial. It was really impressive. And it was almost like a ball dropped right there. I realized, whoa, there's this whole other world of martial arts I haven't really even thought about. I've read stuff and played with swords and stuff, but I never really thought there was an art the same as I knew from Asian martial arts. And through that, I was basically working with Arma after that because it piqued my interest in HEMA. And then eventually, we were running a study group in Florida for Arma, we ran into Meyer's work, and it was just kind of stunning because on several levels. Firstly, because the images were just fantastic. I mean, you can actually take a high-definition digital picture of one of those plates and blow it up to life size, and it still retains its clarity and detail. It's quite amazing. And then the other side of it, for me, as a Jeet Kune Do guy, was how eclectic Meyer was. One of his sayings is, every man is different, so every man fights differently. And he has all these little sayings about how you must make the art work towards you. Just like Bruce Lee used to say, you can't just cookie cutter martial arts out. People have to kind of take it on, and everyone's going to take it on a little bit differently, focus on different things. So that struck me immediately. And along with it being the most verbose of all the manuals that you can get from the HEMA world, and there's a lot of them, but this is the first one, and as far as I know, really the only one that was dedicated to delivering the entire art to the person in the book. Most of the other manuals, or all of the other manuals that I know of, are basically manuals built, made by an author as a guide to someone who already did art. So a lot of the basic concepts and stuff are not even in it. They just expect you to know it, Meyer actually lays them all out. Timing, distance, footwork, it's very, very verbose. It's wonderful. And you put that together with the plates, and you really got an outstanding resource for how they fought in the 16th century.
Now, Mike, let me ask you, let me backtrack a quick second for the audience that may not be familiar with the general Western martial arts community. When you refer to HEMA, HEMA is historical European martial arts. And
Right.
that is a movement that is, I would say, I may be off by a few years here, but the HEMA movement's probably about 20, maybe at most 25 years old. And
Yeah,
as far as
I mean, in the modern era, there's earlier attempts at this by Hutton in the 19th century in England. The whole Bartitsu thing, and those guys were all training in a whole bunch of martial arts there, and they actually were resurrecting portions of Meyer's work and made a little art out of it with fencing masks to fight each other, you know.
Nice. And in the modern world, this has been going. I know that there's a few major groups, and I was drawn to, seminars early on. I've taken a few seminars with different camps in this community, and they all have really interesting information. Meyer was something that was unknown to me until I actually, made contact with you and began to learn more about Meyer's work. You mentioned that the manuals kind of stand out in comparison to some of the other manuals from the period. Tell us about Meyer. When in history is he active? Where and what's the backdrop for his training?
Well, the backdrop of his training really is the history around the Central European Protestant wars in the 16th century. Around Meyer's time, they were becoming acutely aware that there was going to be a lot of war coming because they had a whole Reformation movement going on. And Meyer was what you called a Calvinist, which is like the supercharged, religious guy in the Protestant world. And they, if you read some of the history, a lot of that area, there was no Germany at the time. It was a bunch of free cities, and with the Holy Roman Empire above it. And the free cities was where printing really got its start. That was what they called free art. So places like Strasbourg, where Meyer did his work. He wasn't born there, but he did his whole kind of career as a Fechtmeister and running of a school and putting on Fechtschule events, which were the big entertainment of the day. He'd been doing that. He did that there for over 10 years. We know from some of his marriage records and stuff like that. And as a free city, it was a place where all free men around would go to practice their free art. And fencing was just one of them, and printing and writing and all these little things that were improving at the time were all happening around that area. That's why you have an explosion of these books out of that area. A lot of the guys who wrote books from that area were all Freifechter. Basically, we think it was like a journeyman rank that you were given by your own school. It meant you could now travel and learn from other schools and not shame home school,
Now, Mike, how many works did Meyer produce in his career?
We know of 3. That's one more than when I started working on Meyer, because a third one was found. And he makes mention to a couple of others. And his other 2 works are the 1560, which was a manual he made for a noble patron of his, and then another one pretty much closer to the end of his life, where it was more like a glossa, which is not so much a writing of your own book. It was writing your own book and then including another person's work and making comments on it. He did that. He had Ross Fechten in there, which is horseback fencing, sword and buckler, and then he wrote his own longsword and rapier books to put inside it. None of those were as extensive as the big 1570, which was his major book that was put through a printing press and distributed everywhere.
Now, the content of his works, the works that you and the Guild are working from, what is unique in your perspective to his work compared to the other fight masters at that time that were printing their manuals and the ones that came a little bit before him? Because if I understand correctly, he comes a little bit later in the timeline.
Yes, he's kind of at the end of the time of the German schools of the Kunstgefecht and longsword, which was his primary weapon he taught beginning of his book, was really no longer in use anymore in the same way it had been earlier, but it was considered a foundational weapon. And basically he would teach you longsword and then the art behind and the concepts behind the Kunstgespechten, which is the German Bushido, basically. You know, it's basically a concept-based view of combat across multiple weapons as if it were all one art. It's not section. You don't fight this way and this and that way and that. The whole art kind of is a continuation, which is one of the things that struck me. When I saw how many weapons he had in it and how deep it was, I thought, wow, this guy has really, it's almost like they had a samurai who delivered all the wonderful stuff on the whole art of Bushido, you know. That's very valuable in terms of resurrecting a style that's dead, has no lineage, nothing to be based on too heavily. And, you know, so there can be a lot of, you know, interpretations are going to be different amongst people anyway, but when you have something that's very specifically written down, not so vague, it's, you know, they don't expect you to know it, so they explain it more. It makes it very valuable, I think.
So at this point, Meyer becomes your guy. I mean, this is the work that you decided to dedicate yourself to. How does the guild come into formation? Tell me how you and the other founding members established this school, this organization to research and train Meyer.
Well, we were a study group under ARMA, and during our 6 years as an ARMA study group, we used to hold local gatherings up in the middle of Florida, and everyone in Florida would come together, and, you know, anyone who was interested in HEMA, and we would teach and fight. And basically we ended up with another 3 study groups under ARMA in Florida. And then we as a study group here in South Florida had a bit of a falling out with John Clements, and he basically booted everyone in Florida out. But we'd already been working together, so at that time we'd been into Meyer for about a year, and it had changed everything that we did. I mean, when I look back on what we were doing before we started to study Meyer directly, we were missing a lot in what we were doing. So we basically just decided, hey, you know, we didn't want to make a hodgepodge art for people. We didn't want to, you know, run around a bunch of different arts and try to put something together. Instead, we wanted to see what it would be like if it just focused on one master who gives you this really big scope look at the art. If we just focus on him for many years, what would that be like, you know? And we didn't think too much about what we thought would be good to fight with this weapon. And we listened to what he said and had a little bit of trust in the fact that this guy was a very, very well respected master in the system. And they talk about him hundreds of years later in later fencing treatises. He was a very well educated man when it came to martial arts. In his last book he talks about, he gives something like 6 or 7 other nations that he learned fencing from. So he was traveling around. We think he was a military man, like a cavalry commander, and he was going and working as a mercenary or whatever, and picking up martial arts as he went. So when he came back to Germany, he brought back, amongst other things, you know, his Balinese side sword. And he was the teacher that was basically the first one to bring into common use in the German territories of the thrust with each other, because they had rules about that with each other. They could stab other nationalities, but not each other.
Interesting. And then, Mike, the guild has grown tremendously. You have something in the number of upwards of 500 members, study groups.
That's our estimation from our last census. It's always a little bit vague. I mean, it's always going to be a little bit of a difference in the numbers, I think, because we have to count. Because, like, if you just take my study group, for example, you know, we have maybe 10 people who are every weekers, you know, and then we have another 5 people or so they come once a month, and then we have another 5 or 6 who come every month or two, and you know what I mean. So we have to kind of make a kind of a range estimation. But we have 54 study groups now in 13 countries, and our last census we did gave us a number from 350 to 500 as our membership.
And nonetheless, it's a very impressive number of people willing to dedicate themselves to the study of just one system. Now, what I find more interesting is that most modern martial arts or modern practitioners are involved with schools that have a direct master, that have an unbroken lineage to some tradition. But for people to invest so much into a tradition that doesn't have a link, and to my knowledge, there is no direct link that we know of to Meyer's work. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Okay. So that brings me to my next question, Mike. I understand a little bit more now about what you're doing. Why are you doing it? Why make that choice to put in so much work? Because it must be a tremendous effort to not have someone just to ask a direct question to and have research this.
And part of what we're doing is trying to be that for people, because when it's a lot of work when you try to interpret something and test it, and not everyone wants to do that. Some people just want to show up and study a martial art, and be told, hey, this is do this, this, and this, and you're going to be able to do this, this, and this,
So why?
it is tough.
And why did you feel it was? Right. I'm sorry. Why did you feel it was worth your time to put in that much effort into something that was needing so much work?
Well, originally I was just doing what everyone else in HEMA was doing, which was just looking for another blade art to work on, And when I found that there were techniques that I could look at, pick up little tricks to add to my Filipino repertoire, it made sense. So I got into it. I did it more the way Arma did, which was basically I'm trying to put together a bunch of stuff that I see and make it into a cohesive art, of my own though, really, because it's nothing. I'm learning everything from one source. But being able to do that in Meyer makes a huge difference, in my opinion. It gives you a conceptual overview of the entire art, and then you pick, because for example, his weapons are longsword, dusak, which is like a machete, dagger, combat wrestling, staff or spear, halberd, pike, and then rapier, which is more of a cut and thrust than a traditional true rapier, which is, all thrusting. His was more the military style of 50-50 cut and thrust. So, he has a lot of, for one thing, it's, we may not have a lineage, but we have this guy who was an expert in his time, able to talk to us directly. And he says in the book himself that you cannot learn this art from a book. You have to take it and take these concepts and try to use them. And that's where I think we've started to find why we do this and why I focus more on Meyer, is because having this overview gives me this continuum of concepts in what I'm doing in his art. I'm able to stay within a group of weapons and keep working on all the little things that make each of those weapons work, in the overall art. And having someone who's a Fechtmeister from the 16th century be able to tell you that, of course, it's not easy. There's a lot of interpretation, and a lot of it can be very different opinions from one person to the next. But that's one of the things we manage as a guild. We don't advocate a guild official version of how to do something in Maya. We realize that as long as you can demonstrate it martially and it makes sense, and you can explain why you've got this view, then it's valid and we should listen to it,
And that in and of itself is very much in the spirit of what Meyer himself is quoted as saying, that each person is different.
Yes, exactly.
Now, Mike, let me ask you this: the work that you do, and I've started through you and the guild to research Meyer myself and to try to incorporate Meyer. I work on a much more narrow area of Meyer than you do, and that some of the other members of the guild do. I still
Right, working on dagger.
I'm working. Yeah, I'm working on dagger. I'm a knife guy. Can't get away from that dagger. But and I'll use myself as an example. I've grabbed some of the material as best as I can decipher it from Meyer, to my level of understanding of the material, and I've worked it with guys in my knife community, and it holds up. It holds up really well.
Yes, very much.
What has your experience been with testing the various methods, using the various weapons against, brothers in free play from different schools, maybe even Eastern schools? Have you done any of that? Is that part of what you guys do to test out the material?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, I've been teaching in the park here for the last 15 years, about 13 of them doing Meyer. And we fight every single weekend. Every Sunday we fight. Everyone fights each other with the different weapons. We put on gear to protect us, do a bit of, but we also do stuff with minimal gear because you have to do it like you're going to fight if you really want to make it effective. I mean, to me, I'm an old Filipino knife guy. I love it. I love that. And if I hadn't done all that great Filipino work, I would not have known how to pull some of this out. Having that kind of experience helped me a lot. But I can say that one of the things that I always wondered about in the Filipino work was how they didn't do as much stabbing, as much point thrusting, And Meyer really focuses heavily on that. So it's almost a perfect overlay to my Filipino work,
Now, Mike, interesting that you bring that up, and I'm probably going to get put in the doghouse for saying this, and I hope nobody takes it the wrong way. I'm not trying to be critical, but Filipino martial arts is not my specialty. I have some training in that area, but not. I'm not a specialist by any means. But one thing that, let me frame it as a positive, not making a negative on another, school of thought. But one thing that I found from the Western arts, blade arts, and Meyer included, is that I almost want to say it's a different and maybe a more profound understanding of distance and timing.
Well, they have fencing as their reference usually for that timing, and that has a very advanced concept of it, I think.
From my point of view, that's one of the, strong suits, and one of the most important things you can take away from training in the Western martial arts, as opposed to training in some of the Eastern blade arts.
Well, that, and I think there's a almost over-focused, view of how you do it. The practicality of Western arts is very profound sometimes, and I found that with most of them. They were very much interested in how things actually work and making it work that way. So you don't see a lot of fluff in there.
And I can appreciate that, especially speaking to some people in the Eastern blade and stick arts. Some of the older people, or people that have trained with some of the older people directly, have often given me that insight that, hey, what we're doing right now in 2016, that's not what these old timers were doing. Some of those things are kind of, some schools have become so dependent on drills. They drill like crazy. They make up 1,000 different templates and drills and things that they're doing. And a lot of guys I've talked to, guys like James Hogue and Mark Lawrence, they've told me that hey, no, this stuff is was a little bit simpler when we picked it up, and we're a little bit more direct with it. And I think that that's something that's seen very clearly in the older European manuals, because for the most part, those manuals were created for, times of war, and it wasn't, a recreational martial arts environment.
You can see a lot of stuff in there that you just wouldn't learn in a martial arts school. It's ruthless.
Yeah, it is a brutal thing. Now, Mike, let me ask you this. So we've talked about who Meyer was a little bit. We talked about how you discovered him and how the guild was formed and the direction that you're going with the teaching. What are you envisioning for, the guild and what it's promoting over the next couple of years? What are you hoping to accomplish with that?
Well, I mean, our main goal has always been to make the art live again. That's the main goal. have it be in use by people that makes an art alive. But we follow Meyer very specifically, so I have a whole article on this. But basically, it's a recognition that if you don't train the way you might fight, you're not fully preparing yourself. So at some point in an art, and I see this in almost all bladed arts, you need to be able to deal with a blunt version of the weapon you're going to fight against with nothing on. If you truly want to get to that point where you feel like you can handle it, and you have to get there and do that quite a bit to become comfortable there. So for us, I don't know, there's a whole totality in what you're doing to get to these arts. So being able to put together something like this and have other people working on separate side projects and everybody working on something together makes for what I call a shit pile. You just keep building it up, and then you turn around one day and you've got this body. So far we've been doing it for the last over a decade now, and we've got maybe 45 people ranked in our curriculum for various weapons, and we have people using Meyer's art in commercial schools that teach other fencing, like classical fencing or sport fencing, or in other martial arts studios that teach, Kali. So we're building on that, and to do that, we really need to dig at Meyer's work. It's an enormous amount of material to get through. We've been doing it for over a decade, and I feel like we're just scratching the surface of what this guy has to teach us, So, I mean, there's various methods of testing it. The modern HEMA sport, for example, they all wear heavy gloves, a gambeson mask and stuff, and they'll do like full-on, full speed, full power kind of fighting, And then you have the kind of thing you would see in a Filipino school sometimes, which is two people using a blunt blade, either a small sword or a dagger or something, and then going through the same fighting methods you would do if you were all, protected up. So with that in mind, our goal is to one day produce a tournament where we fight against each other, and we either go dry or wet, depending on the tournament. In the beginning, we're going to do a couple of dry ones to kind of prove that we have it takes an enormous amount of control to do that kind of thing. So you have to prepare for it. We're thinking at least 6 months ahead of time. And that's what I'm going to be trying to pull off next year. Having, 15 or 20 of us do a tournament dry where we, have open target. It'll be effectual rules, so it'll be no grappling, no thrusting, no kicking in the nuts. And you'll basically use the art to hit the other guy, and it has to be a reasonable hit. It can't be a little tippy-tap, but you also don't blast him in the skull. So I think that it's a possible thing, because I've seen people do it with Boken and Kenjutsu, and I've seen people do it in Filipino Kali and Eskrima. So I think it's possible in our art, too, So we want to push the envelope on that, create something that was pretty much almost what Meyer was doing back then.
It's pretty ambitious, and I'm really interested in seeing how that turns out. It looks like it'd be a lot of fun. A lot of fun.
There's a lot of people who think I'm insane, but I have an article on the whole concept behind it. And one of the things that has made me feel like that thing meant something was having Filipino schools use it, because hey, that's a good justification of why you need to not have gloves sometimes. Not all the time, but you need to be able to, use your art just the way it was intended, the way it would be used. So you have to go into that zone a little bit if you want to get to that, I think.
Yeah, no, and I agree with you. I mean, I've done some training with, hard trainers and very minimal equipment as far as not with swords, but with knives. and it changes the game completely. You have a different you have a very different appreciation of your defense, and you're not as cavalier, running around.
That's right.
Jumping around. So it really makes
the respect is instant. Yeah.
Yeah, the respect is there, and you really do have to rely on technique. Now, Mike, speaking of technique, the one thing I came away with from Meyer, and you actually wrote a nice article for our upcoming quarterly magazine about this, was transitioning Meyer's material into modern day weapons. Now, right. I'm very modern in my approach and my look, my view of martial arts. I mean, when I think of things, I'm always thinking in the modern application. I don't necessarily think in the historic sense. And when I was looking at Meyer, I'm like, wow, this is machete material. When I'm looking at the Dusac, this is, me using my expandable baton when I'm looking at the Dusac and using my expandable baton with some of the dagger techniques. There's tons of information there that translates so well to modern self-defense. Do you think that
it's improved my stick fighting and my knife fighting, being able to bump up against such, detailed descriptions of little tricks, Now,
do you think that people have an appreciation for how practical Meyer is for modern self-defense? Because I can imagine people would see what you're doing and look at the manual, and see the pictures and the plates and say, oh, these guys are, doing Renaissance fair or something, and not really connect and realize, no, this stuff is actually, on a different level and totally applicable to what we need for self-defense even today.
Oh, yeah. I mean, if you take longsword, for example, well, that's something that translates into a war club or a baseball bat, and if you just do a little bit of thinking about what is the different usage of that art behind the weapon, well, there's a whole bunch of stuff you don't need to worry about because you don't have an edge. But all the principles, the timing, how you view fighting, how you attempt to control the opponent, all those things remain the same. And I've been doing Dusac into stick for a while now, and there's a whole bunch of stuff in there now in my stick style that is straight out of Dusac, but that I never really was given in any capacity when I did Filipino, because it was a different way of looking at things. So I think it very much applies in that manner, Stuff like staff is universal anyway, and dagger, geez, that's the modern world. If it's an art that you can use, it's alive, I think.
Now, are you promoting that with students? Are you, saying, hey, this is modern self-defense as well, or are you just focusing?
No, to tell you the truth, I do the articles and I give it out to them, but I don't push it. And most people are here to learn the Western stuff, So I just, I put it out there, and every now and then I'll give a class of stick based on Dusac, to try to keep it within the system, or what we would call Stockvectum in German.
Gotcha. Now, Mike, let me ask you another question regarding the material and the progression and how you're using it in the guild. If a student is interested in becoming part of the guild and starting to pick up the material and work with it, where do you start them off? I know that you said Meyer would start people off with longsword. Do you guys do the same thing?
Yes, we try to follow exactly what he taught. He had the book sections in an order for a reason, I believe. So he wants you to kind of start. You don't have to, but it's the right way to do it, because the longsword is where you learn the lion's share of what that quintessfectin is. You learn your timing, you learn your parts of the fight, and the description of distance, all those things, and your footwork gets all outlined in longsword. And then it's all applied to the next level. The way Meyer puts it is that you can do everything with the Dusac that you can do with the longsword, with the reality of the fact that it's a different weapon applied. So it's not everything, but pretty much it's the same thing. So what I tell people is, I advise them to, but they don't have to, But it works better that way. And I usually give people, Meyer's got a very laid out style, It's not like Filipino. In Meyer, he has a set of guards, which are basically defensive and offensive positions, and you move through them, And then there's handworks, which are all these collections of techniques that you use a lot of times when you're up in the bind, or some of them are from outside, you work your way in, and then he's got a vision that's kind of uniform across the whole system of weapons. So it gives you a lot of options.
Mike, let me ask you, the goal of our group, the Raven Tribe, is developing warriorship as a lifestyle, not just focusing on physical martial arts. A lot of Eastern martial arts have an element of spirituality or character development or a deep, underlining philosophy to living life. Did the Western masters have something comparable? Was that part of their training or what they were teaching?
Well, yeah. I mean, absolutely. What Meyer's art is generally known as is part of the Ritterlich, which means knightly, or the knighthood, the knightly arts. And the knights had virtues. They differed a little bit from culture to culture, but generally speaking, they had courage and humility and, all the, important things that make up for a good warrior, a good balanced warrior. A lot of times, one of the things we like to do is when we have our own, like for instance, when we do this dry tournament I'm talking about, we're not going to have judges. We're going to have a referee who starts the fight. But we do a whole lecture to our people on it before they start it. Listen, you're not just doing longsword as part of the Ritterlich. You're doing these other things too. So you and how you deal with your winning and losing, and what we want is people to acknowledge the other guy. Oh, you won it. Winning is not the most important part. You learn to put your ego aside, and that's all part of that Ritterlich, the knightly arts. You basically had a whole bunch of important aspects that grew you as a warrior, and if you were deficient in them, you were less effective as a warrior. And now that doesn't even take into account the religious side of it, because there's a whole religious element to this, which we don't really delve into in the modern world because it gets uncomfortable. But we want to one day have a whole understanding of what because a lot of these fencing orders were named after St. Mark, St. Michael, St. George. So they kind of symbolically were extensions from the earlier orders in the Byzantine Empire, where they had these fighting warrior societies that were much like the Templars. They were spiritual men and warriors at the same time. So there's several angles to this. We have how the knightly arts temper your character and how you behave amongst your peers, and then you have the religious side of it. And then on top of that, you've also got the alchemical side, where you've got the kind of esoteric underground stuff of those times. For example, Marazzo is pictured in his book, kneeling down under a magical circle. He was an alchemist, or had alchemic, interests. So you see it kind of on multiple levels. Probably the most dynamic part of that is the warrior orders, though. All these guilds were kind of emulating these warrior orders that had been around for centuries. And
you foresee that as becoming an area of study for members at some point in the future?
I mean, I can speak for a lot of the people in my guild. This is not just a martial art for us. It's a lifestyle, and you're trying to resurrect warrior craft. So it's not just techniques and discipline, but it's also your understanding of your character and how you need to build on or shave off something, That's all part of it as well. Anytime you're doing martial arts, you're introduced to humility, whether you like it or not.
Very true. Very true. Well, Mike, tell the audience where we can learn more about the Guild and about yourself and all the activities that are going on.
Well, if you go to freifechter.com, FREIFECHTER, you can see our website, and we have an enormous amount of material for training and reference for Meyer's works. You can also go to the Wiccan Hour, which is a wonderful site run by one of our good friends, That's Wiktenauer. Basically, that is like a reference for all the manuals that we know of. It's got a listing of all the masters from all the various nationalities. Cause there's stuff in German, there's stuff that's French, there's stuff that's Italian, English. There's a lot of stuff out there. So that's a good spot too. And we're also a member of the HEMA Alliance, which is a large American HEMA organization.
Excellent.
So you can get lots of good information there too as well. And find something near you to go check it out. That's the best way.
Excellent, excellent. Well, Mike, thank you very much for your time. I really appreciate you coming on and talking to us about a subject that, a lot of people, I'm sure are going to be, this is going to spark a lot of interest for a lot of people. They're going to be introduced to, because the Western martial arts, the resurgence is growing, and I've seen it getting stronger over the last 2 decades, but it's still relatively unknown to the majority of the martial arts population. But I think it goes a long way to give some insight to the audience that there are these arts that do exist. We're very complete and have a lot to offer the individual.
Good way to put it.
Yeah. Well, Mike, thanks again.
Thanks for having me, man. I appreciate it.
No, it's been a pleasure, man. Thank you so much.